All right, it is May 3rd. And it is amazing that May is just on. April showers have been coming down. And there's a lot going on to talk about. We have a great guest today. It is the Digital RoundTable. It's starting the month of May. Before we get rolling here, we're going to ask our own John Sibley Butler for some music.
Well, you know, we had a great birthday in Austin, Texas. Willie Nelson is still playing at 90 years old. I said, Willie, how did you live to be 90 and play? And he said, roll me up and smoke me when I die. If anyone don't like it, just look them in the eye. I didn't come here and I ain't leaving. Don't sit around and cry. Roll me up and smoke me when I die. There ain't gonna be no sad and teary eyes. It's my time to get my wings and fly. Tell my friends, there's a party, come on by. Roll me up and smoke me when I die. Just take me out and build a roaring fire. And roll me in the flames for about an hour. Then take me out and twist me up, point me to the sky. Roll me up and smoke me when I die.
Woo! Nice. Very nice, Johnny. John Sibley Butler, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. I've been very busy as a professor of ideas and as a professor with my research and how people are trying to solve different kinds of problems. Everything from the entrepreneurial point of view to what we talk about so much here on energy and going forward with energy. And as Llewellyn has talked about, all of the things that we have tried out with hydrogen, ropes, and every other kind of thing. So to me, I've seen an up peak, if you will, an upshot in people looking at how do we solve problems by the entrepreneurial process. And I think that's been driven also by the climate change kinds of situations. There's a lot of talk about climate change. There's a lot of talk about what insurance companies would do. There's just a lot of talk about what would the planet look like. And of course, where we are in looking at and thinking about energy, there's just a lot of uncertainty on what's going to happen in the future. Shall I buy an electric car? Shall I keep a gasoline, a combustion engine kind of car? And, you know, really for the first time in a long time, this is where politicians have become more prominent. Even when you go back and look at the case studies of Edison, when you look at the case studies of Rockefeller and oil and gas, well, then the politicians would come in when they did, when you had to break them up, when they did so well. But for the most part, the scientific community was independent of that. And there is almost, Andreas, a conflict between science and how.
Oh, you're muted. You got muted, Johnny. Johnny, you're muted.
Natural energy and health and all of these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a pretty interesting. Of course, we still have the problems around the globe, whether it's war, whether it's earthquakes. And what's different is that it comes into our homes now. It's like the Vietnam War. I can see what's happening in Honduras. I can see what's happening in some parts of Africa. I can see what's happening in some parts of Europe. So there's a combination of the 1960s and a consciousness around the world. And this hippie return to natural medicine, this hippie return to not trusting science and technology. So I think philosophically, we're in an interesting place. But on the other hand, Austin, Texas is a great day in Austin, Texas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Llewellyn King, how are you, sir?
Well, with reluctance, I have to say that I particularly enjoyed Johnny's song today. I thought it was really excellent, and I very much subscribe to its motivation. When the opportunity of smoking you, Johnny?
Well, I never have tried the stuff, but Willie Nelson, I consider a good friend, and he wrote the song "Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die."
It's a great song, it really is, and your rendition of it is quite excellent. And that concludes any sense of truce between us for this day.
I understand.
The world is at a time of change. We're right on the cusp of new things, different things, and front and center of this is going to be in our world artificial intelligence. People have been threatening its arrival, worrying about its arrival. It's become the great ghostly thing. Will it be a Frankenstein monster? Will it destroy civilization? Will it enhance civilization? Is it the future of many things? So I've been doing some reporting on it, and it's quite fascinating. But what is going to change is huge. I fear the first victim of artificial intelligence, and I've talked to quite a few people about it and read a great deal, is truth. We won't know what is truth, because once artificial intelligence has meddled with databases, meddled with the, say, encyclopedias, we won't know. Or when it puts out information that is dishonest, we will not know. I'm also told there are things called backdoors, which if you have a perfectly legitimate artificial intelligence undertaking, a backdoor is a way of altering the result, and it cannot be detected that it's been altered. So that's the bad side. The upside is it will help with lots of things, probably help with medicine, and certainly it will change the way we live. Privacy, for example, I suspect has gone the way of spats, steam engines, and very swiftly the necktie. It's going to be in the past. We're going to talk about it the way we talk about dial telephones, because there will be very little privacy. The capacity of artificial intelligence to determine who you are with one facial image is frightening. If, for example, Johnny, you're riding on a train, I know you don't do lowly things like that, you're generally limousine driven, but when you're not, or in that souped up car of yours, and affront to the environment, I might say, the fact is you may see somebody who looks familiar, you take a little picture with your cell phone and bang, next thing you know all about them and have their telephone number, which might help the dating world, but it'll be a huge loss of any sort of sense of ability to hide away for the rest of us, privacy. And we don't know. There's a lot of alarmism that we haven't yet had enough attention paid to the benefits and what the limits will be, how we will corral this thing and keep it somewhat under control. We've been very successful at corralling some things, diseases, nuclear weapons. Probably it'll need an international regime, stated we shouldn't do this the way we don't have open air nuclear tests anymore. But mark my words, gentlemen, it is a new day has arrived.
You know, let me add to that.
Hold on, Johnny. Hold on. Let me keep going real quick, because we got a great guest and before we get into it. So our guest today is Bryan Thomas. Hello, Bryan.
Hey, how you doing?
Thanks for being with us. For those of you that don't know Bryan, Bryan is the VP of Clean Energy and Infrastructure Advisory at Lang LaSalle Incorporated, also known as JLL. He's going to be with us for the hour, and JLL is a giant real estate services company that manages billions of square feet of the facilities, and it's involved in all kinds of things, all around the world projects. And what Bryan does is all about solar farms and wind farms and all those things. And Bryan, before JLL, where he has been a significant long-term He was a consultant at the U.S. Army Office of Energy Initiatives. And he is, thank you very much for your service, sir, a retired lieutenant colonel of 20 years in the U.S. Army. Bryan holds a BS in economics from the prominent, well-known, coveted U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and also has an MBA from Michigan University, Stevens M. Ross School of Business. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you, Andres. Thank you.
Absolutely. So Bryan, you've heard these two guys with their opening. You know that this program is all about digital transformations of smart energy, smart buildings, IoT, Internet of Things, 5G, smart vehicles, autonomous things, connected. And one of the most interesting things that we talk about on smart buildings and smart infrastructure is really how all this software, sensors, connectivity is coming to the world that you manage. So I'm curious, what's your take on letting us know what JLL is working on, what you're particularly working on, and where do you see this digitalization changing our lives as the preeminent largest, real estate management company in the planet?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with what I'm working on and try to answer your question. And so I'm working with both public sector clients and the commercial sector on a lot of renewable energy stuff. And we're getting a lot of traction these days is the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. So doing something right now with the Port of San Diego that wants to increase the battery electric vehicles, or could be hydrogen as well. Looking at a transformation of a public school district around here with its bus fleet. Looking at, you may have heard of NEVI, which is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Act, the $7.5 billion that's going out. So we're helping the state there and trying to figure out where that stuff going is. And just awarded a contract on some work with the Metro here in DC and putting chargers in their parking lots and kiss and rides, trying to figure out business models associated with that and how they can also help the local communities who fund them in helping with the transformation to electric vehicle stuff. I tell people, if an electron would have bit me in the rear end about 10 years ago, I wouldn't have known what it was. I knew vehicle IR from electrical engineering course, but didn't know a lot. And now I kind of have to try to fake my way around it. And just the energy and power sector is just predominant with what we do. And it's interesting you talk about digitization and technology. There's some people here at JLL, we are, as Andre said, we're a huge real estate company. And some people like to say, well, we're going to be a technology firm that does real estate. Mm-hmm. And we're really, and we have a separate entity, JLLT, their technology, and we even have some funds that are looking to make investments in that space. But lots of discussions today on building management processes, smart processing. I was on a pitch today. It was an electric vehicle charging company talking about, hey, you're going to put all these chargers in, but you're going to increase your demand charges, and we got to have smart ways of circuitry and being able to communicate and knowing when to throw this switch, when to turn that on, so we can keep our costs down, but also what I like to say is execute the mission, in this case, charging vehicles. So there's that going on. We have what's called Canopy. A lot of companies are starving for not just information, but useful information. And so I was on a call the other day, a very large corporate entity that is buying power all over the world. And how are they keeping track of that? How is there some way that automates if there's an anomaly out there? And is there some flagging? Is there a way to look at, hey, what's going on here? Is there a way of being able to provide that information to decision makers so managers and leaders can make decisions that are smart? And with the world of sustainability now, whether you like it or not, there's a lot of pressure at the corporate level, from the stakeholder level, and in trying to make sure that they're being good citizens, or they're doing what their stakeholders want. You know, we hear some clients that say, I'm not doing that because it's the bottom line is more important, and I'm not getting pressure from stakeholders, where others, financial institutions, for example, are getting incredible pressure. And then our head of sustainability told an anecdote the other day where he was talking with someone, a client who really wasn't paying attention, or not paying attention is not the right word, but wasn't as focused on some of the sustainability concerns that others are bringing up. And our chief sustainability officer said, you're going to be fired in 2 years if you don't resolve that. And I'm not here to talk necessarily about sustainability, but I think it's utilizing the right tools. You talked about technology, Internet of Things, or how can I use that information to help make decisions? And if I'm getting pushed to make decisions on that from a sustainability perspective, are they grounded in good information? Is it grounded in science, or is the right forecasting tools in place? All that stuff can be improved. But so there is a tremendous improvement or a focus on having tools that are going to allow us to help clients make decisions. And really, I'm kind of the Luddite of the firm, pen and paper and trying to think things out, but I'm going to get left behind. I'm going to be the dinosaur if I don't evolve and do a better job, because that's where the products are going for the client. So I need to evolve myself.
Yeah, well said. Johnny?
Yeah, Bryan, I went over your webpage, and I think that you're definitely in the trending direction. And I did have some question on privatization. I was on President Carter's group to move the military from the draft to the all-volunteer force. And I call it a Milton Friedman's military, although it's certainly done great things. But one of the things that's interesting, and I have a student now who's an ROTC professor who's doing military housing. When you talk about taking the technology to military housing, and when we went from a self-contained military with all of the barracks and everybody being in the same units to being an organizational military based on marketplace standards. So now we're talking about the privatization of military housing rather than people coming together in groups or in units and et cetera. And I did an article on the privatization of all of the people who fight in wars, all of the companies involved. I did an article on that. So my question is as you go through your technology, and let's talk about the case of the military. How do you see the privatization of the military maybe having an impact on cohesion and on values and the defense of the country? It's becoming just another job going from work to housing.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, John, it's interesting that you seemed very familiar with the housing. And I cut my teeth actually when I retired from the Army and I joined JLL. That my first job was I underwrote and did some of the due diligence on some of the deals. So on some of those deals where there are problems, you can blame me. So what were you thinking when you underwrote that or you had those assumptions? I do think as someone who lived in the government-owned housing and now the privatized, and maybe I'm biased because I work for the firm that helped implement a lot of it. I do think there's been some significant improvements. But your comment, John, on I was thinking about the other day here at my own work. I live in a large metropolitan area, and I don't really interact with the people I work with. After I go home, and I don't really interact with it. And I thought about my days living in DeRidder, Louisiana, when I was stationed at Fort Polk, or my many days in Lawton, Oklahoma. We all lived in Lawton, or we lived on Fort Sill, so we interacted with each other. If we were going to do something Friday night, we were all around there, so we could get together, as opposed to living in the DC area where I don't have that. So I do think there is something about being around and cohesion. The things that you mentioned about tribalism, I think I don't know that it's endemic to the military. I think that's more of a societal thing. And we in the military are a product sometimes of what's going on in society. But you bring up a good comment too, and I had this conversation with someone, this is many years ago, I'm going back in time. It used to be the commander was the commander. He or she was king.
No, it was a he, it was not a she.
Was he? Okay, yes. So the commander was God. They did whatever. Then, a few years later, they said, you know what, commander, you got a lot on your plate. So you don't need to deal with the drunk driving and some of the other domestic disputes and some of these other things. We're going to give that to somebody else. So they formed this garrison commander. He's going to run the organization. He's going to be like the city manager, and you can focus on your warfighting stuff. And I had a colleague that came up to me and said, you know what that has done is diminished that authority of the commander. And that kind of gets, and somebody else has a piece of this, someone has a piece of that. You talked a little bit about some of the, and I don't want to get political here, but some of the equity, the sexual harassment training, all these things that have to take place. And they're important, but they take away from training. The job of the military is to, I'll just be blunt, is to kill the bad guys if need be. And we have a lot of other things out there that require time and effort. So I think a little bit about the military as a microcosm of what's going on in society. But I think we have to keep in mind that we have a job to do, and it is different. It's not always about fairness, equity. It's about getting rid of the bad guy to protect all of us here.
It's not about fairness and equity.
Yeah.
It's about defense of the country. Now, Mark Janowitz was my major professor, and Charlie Moscas was my major professor. And I wrote the book, All That We Could Be, with Charlie Moscas on leadership. And let me just say what has happened, and I want to relate back to your research. The military would say, we can fight American wars with anybody. We fought World War II, with World War I with Italian immigrants. But they became a part of the military. There was no self-identification. You were just green, okay? And then with the all-volunteer force, the traditional military, in terms of the values, was there something that you did was over and above the individual. You fought for love of country. You fought to defend the homeland. But now we fight for marketplace standards, okay? And it's the same thing that's happening in corporate world, because I was taught at Northwestern University that all of the rules for corporations came out of the military, the good rules. So when you think and look at that, I think when we look at privatization, we have to really try to understand what the military is for. It's not a social experiment, it's to defend the country, right? And I think we went through that with Italian immigrants, we went through that with Black Americans, we went through that with a lot of people, and the emphasis was just on defending the country. So my question is, given what you do with big data and private enterprise, is the military just another job now? And I'm a Vietnam veteran, I'm a decorated Vietnam veteran, Bronze Star for Combat Valor, AmeriCal. We had the thing that said, we had a cross that said, Cali died for our sins. So I'm there. So is the military just another job now?
I hope not. But I understand your concerns is that we have all these programs to make it just like we're in the corporate world, the benefits, et cetera, are similar, and we just do our job and then go home. I do think, though, that you probably, as you talk with recruits, that there is a sense of service. I sure hope so. But we are having issues right now of attracting enough people. And how we solve that, I don't have the answers for that. But your point being is that, a few years ago, the Marines decided I think all the services might have been having some issues, but the Marines, I think it was General Krolik at the time, said, I'm going to make it harder. And he kind of imposed this certain ethos that we are different, we are separate, and we're good, and we have a shared experience, and it's not just a job, and to do that. And so maybe that, in general, the military, as they can look to try to do that. But I get your point, is let's not forget what the military is about, why it is different. So don't try to make it like everything else. That is a specific and unique mission, and we need to be focused on accomplishing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank
Llewellyn?
This discussion of the military, I'll try to avoid it, except that I would say that I think we've lost a lot in losing with the volunteer army. We've lost a common touch, a common experience, and also a huge educational machine, which the military was. An awful lot of people who came out of the military came out with qualifications that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and they can vary across the board. A friend of mine who was a musicologist, obviously not suited to military work, but they taught him to type superbly, and it stood him in good stead the rest of his life. Another fellow who was a a repairman, had learned electronics and could fix just about any television or anything. He had a career thanks to the military. I think we lose a lot, but mostly we lose knowing about each other. The great mix-up of people, which was true in the little bit of military experience I had many years ago in Africa. I just throw that out. But let's get to the subject. How do you deal with the quick obsolescence, Bryan, which is taking place? We have in New York City a skyscraper over by Grand Central, which is the state-of-the-art building in every way for the environment, except it has gas turbines. I think they're on the 36th floor. And suddenly New York says, yeah, well, you can't have gas turbines. You can't burn gas. It doesn't meet environmental standards. And yet this is a superb example of what can be done if you start with the architect thinking environment. How do you deal with obsolescence? And do you worry about it?
I do worry about it. I don't have an answer on that. So you're referring, some of the laws in New York City, there's a local law 97 that's been implemented that is causing a lot of electrification. I think in general, electrification sounds good, but do you need to be so onerous and just saying outlawing gas? You may have a very efficient building, but it has some other features that are good, and you throw the baby out with the bathwater as a result of that. The area where I think about obsolescence is I think of automobiles, and I'm the kind of person that buys a vehicle and holds it forever and then kicks it off the cliff and then gets another vehicle, probably used. But nonetheless, I've been debating about a new car and should I get an electric vehicle and stuff. And from one hand, I say, well, let it get a little more technology, a little more improvements, economies of scale, other things, and then maybe I'll buy in a couple of years, but I might need something new. But then I look at, well, what's new? When is hydrogen going to be viable? When's that going to be? We looked at I'll use the Port of San Diego as an example, looking at they want to force their drayage, their trucks within the port to move to zero emissions. Well, what's the best way of doing it? Do you let the market decide, or do you make some mandates on what it should be? And so there were a lot of debates about how open should we be? And the more we're working on batteries at San Diego, but every day I'm opening the paper and there is capital flowing into the hydrogen space. So how long is it going to be that is it going to take? Are we going to is capital going to be deployed at the wrong place? So I do worry about obsolescence, but I do think I'm a truster of the market for the most part. And I think the market will move where it needs to go. I do fear sometimes of the government getting too involved. I'm bringing my personal views to it. But just in general, your question is, you do question obsolescence, but I guess, isn't that always been the case? Things change fast now. I think it's just reality, the technology and the ability to change. But how long is it? The internal combustion engine has been along for a while. The horse and cart was around for a much longer time period. And then, so let's say that we do go to electric vehicles, maybe that's going to have a much shorter lifespan. And maybe we just need to get used to that.
Yeah.
I'd like to follow up, if I might, quickly. You mentioned in your opening remarks both a school bus fleet and installing charging stations. Both of these have an impact on the electric grid.
Yeah.
If you're going to charge school buses, 300 or 400 possibly, you need to really beef up the electric supply to the point of charging. You can't do it on with two prongs of a plug. And likewise, if you're going to have a lot of charging, the chances are you're probably going to see initially, at least in the next 10 years, most of that charging happening in affluent places, which produces another disruption to the electric grid, because you'll have much more electric demand at 6 o'clock, say in Westchester, than you would in downtown DC, or at least in say, Anacostia. You live in DC, and I used to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of those are valid comments about what we need to think about. So clearly there's an infrastructure implication. There's both a grid implication. We've been talking to some utilities and they think that having enough power out on the grid isn't the issue. I think the issue is having enough power where it needs to be, when it needs to be there is an issue.
That is the issue, yes.
Yeah. And then getting into some of the issues of equity, where are you one group is subsidizing another for that. Those are some of the interesting things that we get to think about, especially on with the infrastructure stuff. It's easy, people talk about, oh, why don't I just put up panels here? Why don't I just put up electric vehicles here? Sounds so simple. I mean, the sun shines, or I plug it in, and what's so difficult about that? But there clearly is a large infrastructure impact and a lot of thoughts that have to go into that. And that's kind of where we try to step in and really try to think through. If you really thought that is really planned through, you want to do something, but it's going to have a significant impact on your infrastructure, and maybe the utilities can't provide that, or they can, but it's going to be cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Now, Bryan, let me get this question in. Bryan, I'm working with a company for plugging in cars, and they tell me that most of the plug-ins are in China. The guy's named Ron Hamilton, and they are creating plug-ins to move them from China, because everything that we need to create the charging station for automobiles, if we do them, Andres, we're doing 50 miles apart on I-35. Most of the parts are made in China.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see, and I can give you Jerome's information, and they've done a great job in, quote, bringing that kind of technology back to the Western Hemisphere, not necessarily just to America, but to Mexico and to Puerto Rico and et cetera. So as Lou Allen would say, do we have the materials in America to produce the plug-ins? Is it true that most are made in China? Where are we on the supply chain materials to put all of these charging stations in America? Are we dependent on China, which might be fine if they come through, but are we dependent on China? I think the answer is yes, but if you have a different answer, I would love to know.
I don't know. I agree with you. Our supply chains are contingent on China to extent, and that's why how we can, both from the charging equipment perspective and on the battery. So there's two things that need to be looking at. I'm actually next week going up. I'm working in support of the Department of Energy, looking at long duration energy storage, and the government is giving out grant money for that, and they're looking at non-lithium solutions. So I'm looking at other technologies, and part of the premises of that, John, is that these would be technologies that would not be as dependent upon a foreign supply chain. And let's be honest, it's
what I do have is a company in Minnesota who jumped ahead everybody 2 years ago to start producing these things, and I would love to just send you an email to do that. So the next question then is given the reality of the supply chain and given the reality of the world, do you see any disruptions in the future? Whether it's over Taiwan, whether it's over this, whether it's like, the iPhone was disrupted. How do we move forward in America, technological wise, without bringing the significant components to be made in America? And do we have enough raw materials to make them in America? And that means, Andreas, your computer will go from, or your charging station will go from $6.95 to $25.95 when American labor is involved. So how do you see that, Bryan? It's just interesting. Well, I've been in this area a long time.
You're really asking me to think here. And in general, I'm a free marketer. Understand I'm not an absolute. I'm a fan of Milton Friedman, you mentioned. I'm not an absolute free market, and there's some reasons for national security or other things. I'm really getting into more foreign policy. I think a lot of it comes down to our relationships with our allies or even with our enemies and keeping them friendly, because to try to move everything in the US, and even we've had an uptick in manufacturing recently, but I think a lot of that's government generated, government incentives, and we're trying to really push the manufacturing. I think we need to be really strategic on what areas we're going to try to keep from a strategic perspective, because let's be honest, the government doesn't do a good job of picking winners and picking winners and losers. That's really not our job. So I think it's important. I think from COVID, we learned a lot too about supply chains, and not just in the technological perspective or sector. We saw that in the pharmaceutical as well. So I am all for looking at from our strategic national defense strategy and looking at from a supply chain and manufacturing, are there some things that we're going to make a decision on trying to source internally, looking at our allies and relationships. But I do fear, overstepping the bounds, and that has impacts on the economy because we're not allocating capital appropriately when we do that.
Do we have a policy to bring technological defense stuff back to America, to be made in America? I think we do. I think that under the previous administration, I think that we were working on that. But is there a policy right now that says, if I am making socks in China and getting socks from China for the military, if I have a sock factory in New Jersey, let's scale it up?
Yeah.
You don't have to answer that, because I think there's a policy
there's some made in America policies. There's also some of the stuff that I work in is Buy America. So for even in the solar world, if we're going to do a project on a military installation, the military is buying the power, the Buy America, it needs to comply. So the $7.5 billion I mentioned in the NEVI, so that's the charging funds, the grant money that's going out to the states and municipalities. There is a Buy America aspect right now, and a lot of the manufacturers saying we can't meet that. You're going to have to give us a little more time to do that. I was on a call this morning with an EV charging entity that says, hey, we're all Buy America. Now they're level 2 chargers, not level 3, but right now getting level 3 electric vehicle chargers that meet Buy America standards is difficult. It's going to take a while for that to happen.
So let me jump in here now and see if I can pepper Bryan with a few things to get the perspective of what's happening. I think our audience is really interested in where things are heading. So let's talk energy real quick, Bryan. So one point of view is that, gee whiz, this clean energy goal is so easy to solve. Why don't we just cover half of Delaware, 900 square miles with solar panels, and put transmission lines and deliver the 1,100 gigawatts and be done? But why aren't we doing that?
Well, that gets into the issue of, if it's so simple, everyone would do it. So first of all, taking up that amount of land is land has value. Now you can put it out in the desert. There's plenty of land out there, but getting it to where you need to get it to. So a lot of it has to do with our transmission issues. And I think that's an area that folks have realized there's a deficiency in trying to do that. So I would say that's a big thing. Then the second one is producing power when you need it. So, as we know right now, our peak demand right now is after the sun goes down. People come home, they turn the lights on, they're doing this, the air conditioner's running, etc. Yet the sun, the solar's not producing, or maybe the wind's not going. So clearly there has to be the issue du jour is storage. As I mentioned, next week I'm going to be looking at long duration. So trying to pair storage with generating assets is waiting to do. So I think we got plenty of land. Like I said, you could find a place the size of Delaware, plop it in the desert, but it's not the right place. It's not near the load. So even if you had a way of moving it to where it needs to go, you got line loss, you got other things that are going to have to come into play. I think technology is big. I wish I knew more. If you ever sat in the control center of PJM or ERCOT, I haven't done that, but I gotta imagine it's fascinating is trying to schedule power, where it needs to go, when it needs to go, who you're going to ask to turn on, what kind of advance warning are you going to get. I'm kind of rambling a little bit on that because I haven't been there, but I do find it fascinating, and it's something that we have to think through. But clearly, it's the transmission piece, and I'm in PJM here, and we have, if you want to do a project right now, so let's say you could use the whole state of Delaware. You can't get the transmission queue is so long, interconnection queue is so long, it's years right now, so you couldn't even do anything. So they're looking to do reforms associated with that as we speak.
So on the other side of the equation, there is the notion that, no, forget centralized production, the utilities are a monopoly, they're not going to change all these right-of-way issues. It should all be solar panels on homes and electric vehicles and power walls. And the commercial sector, industrial sector should be leading the way. So why isn't somebody like JLL basically putting a business case in front of all the owners of all the buildings they manage and transform the 20 billion square feet or however many trillion square feet you manage into production of energy and solve the problems of all these challenges?
Yeah, a lot of it is, so hypothetically, it sounds good. Actually executing and risk. We sit around the water cooler all the time, though, actually talking about, we manage a lot of space, as you mentioned. We don't own space, though, so we manage it. Even the place that I'm sitting in right now, we don't know. It's not effective use of our capital. We can deploy our capital differently. But we sit around the water cooler all the time saying, why don't we, as an entity that manages a lot of real estate, why don't we engage in power purchase agreements or large virtual power purchase agreements and allocate them across our clients? There's a benefit to that. You got the sustainability benefits, you got someone managing that. And I think we're just, from a risk perspective, not willing to take that on. Now, maybe our competitor, CBRE, might, and they've done some things. They've bought a renewable energy firm. They've gotten some other things there. They have a fund that's looking at buying land for renewables. So I think but you got to a good point there, Andres, in the area that I see. So the big companies are fine. They're going to do their thing. So all the high tech companies, the Googles, even McDonald's, General Motors, are doing stuff. Where we're finding issues is it's the middle tier companies, or I'm a company that I'm all over the country and I'm renting 10,000 square feet here or that, or I'm an investor-owned REIT or something, but I have buildings here and buildings there. And how can I aggregate things? I think really it's a risk issue. Is someone able to come up with a product that puts risk, who can bear it most efficiently, and come up with ways of aggregation? So these are water cooler conversations. I don't know that our firm has the capital or the risk appetite to do that, but someone's going to do it if we don't, maybe. And so maybe we need to get off our rear ends and try to look at that. The other thing I would say is, now this is my personal opinion, I get paid to help people put solar on their rooftops. But let's be honest. When you do that, in most cases, you're putting a small dent in it, unless you have some large warehouses, distribution centers. But I have an office space in Austin, Texas. And actually, I was looking at a building in Austin not too long ago. I get a couple hundred kW on there. That's nice. It looks good. The optics are great, but it's really not going to put a dent in my overall sustainability. So I'm a fan of looking to do on-site, but you probably, to make a bigger dent in things, you're going to have to do some other things.
Got it. Llewellyn?
I find that interesting, what you just said, because in fact, Bryan, it is the marshaling of a lot of very small entities that makes distributed energy resources appealing. And when you get, say, a utility system where 25% of people have rooftop solar, that is a very large amount. I suspect the answer is how it is used. If you have an inverter and a battery, that makes it expensive. But I'm impressed by what's happening in some utility system, particularly out west, where they are saying, don't put in a battery, don't put in an inverter, pump the juice straight to the substation, and we will put in the inverter and the battery, because obviously there's a benefit on scale, and ergo we get a dispatchable resource, although it may have 100 or several hundred rooftops feeding into it. So I just think that's interesting. I've been quite struck by the fact that maybe we've been so taken with the rooftop idea that we've misunderstood where it fits in the scheme of things, but it has value. And a lot of utilities I talk to, and like yourself, I talk to utilities all the time, favor rooftop. They don't favor it at the exclusion of utility scale solar, which they need, especially in Texas, which has huge growth in demand because of the migration into Texas. And they're grasping from, they tell me, for almost everything, almost all new generation. But I wouldn't exclude rooftop solar because it's small. The thing is, you've got to have a lot of them. That's my thought. You several times mentioned.
I would just add one thing on that, though. One of the things, though, that's a little bit tough, though. So let's just say that we acknowledge the benefit of the small rooftops. In some states, though, with the net metering rules, that really tampers and limits that. So that's an issue. And I just read an article the other day. Actually, it was from Wood and Mackenzie, Mackenzie Wood report the other day that states actually are pushing back more. They're getting more restrictive on the net metering. So unfortunately, that hurts kind of what you're looking at, Luan. So I just didn't want to.
I think there are several forces at work there, and everybody says, but it doesn't happen. You need some sort of national standard on these things. You can't have New Mexico doing one thing and the neighboring state, Nevada, which favors, by the way, the feeding into a central point of solar power, doing something else, especially as utility service areas do not respect state lines necessarily. We have the jurisdiction problem, but it's interesting. You have mentioned several times, Bryan, hydrogen and fuel cells. I've been looking at fuel cells for 50 years. And they're a little bit like fusion. They're always just over the horizon. They're always just about to arrive. I wonder, are you confident that they're really here now or about to be here?
I'm not. I don't have enough about that. I take a few years ago, I guess it was 2 years ago, I was managing, my wife's has a small, she's a Spanish tutor, small little bit money. She was able to put in her 401k. So I said, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put your money, no, it wasn't a lot, in a sustainable focus. So Cummins engines, because they're doing this, Volta, EV charging, a company called Nikola, which is I think about 50 cents or maybe 80 cents right now. Yeah. And a couple other ones. And one of them was the fuel cell, I forget the fuel cell ones, and they've all done terrible on that.
Blue energy, maybe.
Yeah, it's just I don't have the crystal ball, but you're right. Yeah, I think a lot of people get excited. I the article a few months ago on the fusion, and we found a way of if I understand correctly, making energy out of, creating energy out of this and that. And in reality, you're probably 50 years away or something like that. And even on the hydrogen and fuel cells, it's probably way. I think my take is I'm an optimist on the optimism of American business and capitalism, but I'm a realist when it comes to time. When someone says, because I'll use this all my time, I haven't worked on one real estate development project that ever finished on time. Maybe it's just me, I'm just bad luck and I just haven't been around good people or something. But in general, when someone says it's going to take 2 years, it's 2.5 to 3 years. So if someone says that, they got this new technology and it's going to be ready for commercial viability in 10 years, it's probably 20. Unfortunately, that's kind of my take of the world.
Well, Bryan, there's a great book called The Wisdom of the Crowd. And they were asked the engineers, when will it be finished? And they would say 2 years. They would ask people who walked by there for the last year, when will it be finished? And they would say 4 years. Well, Bryan, I want to ask you about getting things done and solutions to problems. And we have a big problem before us. We have a problem with electrification of everything. And it's not just it's the automobiles, it's everything. We have a problem with emerging technologies and how to get those emerging technologies back on the grid. And Llewellyn made an interesting point. And I asked Andreas yesterday, will we ever build a large scale power plant again? Or is everything going to distributive power in the sense that we will have, many plants everywhere? Now, to do that, you need to integrate all kinds of technologies, and Andreas is working with a guy that's bringing the smartness to the box. Do you believe that in America we're moving away from the large scale? That we will never build another large scale power plant, and it will all be distributed energy at the local level, or at the grid edge, or at housing. So, for example, if you live in Austin, Texas, and live in Great Hills, then the power plant would be distributive, and it would not come from Austin Energy. How do you think about that? Will we have many power plants? How do you think about that?
Yeah, if I did not go to Bloomberg New Energy Finance this year, and that would have been a great question to ask, but I do remember a couple of years when I went, and I was surprised that Mitsubishi and these other large natural gas turbine makers were there and talking a lot about, and obviously they've been biased in what they do in big plants. So, and there is a lot of talk about distributed and peaker plants and going down at the local and distributed level. I just think that there's probably still a need for integrating large plants where you can get economies of scale from a capital perspective in building them and integrating with smaller distributed and finding a way of integrating and figuring out. I know in ERCOT in Texas, a lot of discussion on the capacity markets. And I just think that there would probably be some really good, efficient, large plants that can be, and the smaller distributed stuff is integrated and find the most efficient way of doing it. So I don't think that you get rid of, I think also you get some redundancy and resilience by having, people say, oh, I want to get off the grid. Well, really, you better have some good backups or ways of really being able to do that. So right now, I do think there's value in the large plants. I haven't really checked. I'm not seeing where capital is flowing though. And is that going to be something? Clearly the banks are getting a lot of pressure from not lending, at least on the fossil fuel side. We are seeing some large wind farms. We're looking at really huge offshore wind farms, obviously in the couple gigawatts range. So those will get bigger if when they get built.
So Llewellyn also mentioned the importance of standardization, whether it's computers, whether it's automobiles, whether it's water systems. Do you see that the differences in states and regions, for example, I live in Austin, Texas, we play golf, we see a house with a solar technology on it, we take the golf ball and aim it toward the house, knock the damn solar thing and say, God bless oil and gas. And then somebody would say, yeah, I'm gonna get a new bumper sticker. It's gonna say the North won, the South 0 halftime. Do you see, that's all. Do you see, coming off of Llewellyn, how do we standardize things? When I drive from Texas in a combustion engine and go to Arizona where there's no gas stations, what do we do with standardizations and this quick move? Because remember, we're not switching from one car to another or one book to another. We're switching from the mode of transportation, the technology mode of transportation that makes it go. So how do we standardize things? Will there be certain routes for electric cars? Will there be certain routes for gasoline cars? Or should I take my gasoline cars and start a club of all gasoline so we can meet every year and talk about how great they were. So how do you see the standardization of this? What's going to happen across from New England to Texas to California?
Well, there is. So for electric vehicle charging, there actually is some standardization. So that $7.5 billion that I mentioned had strings attached to it. And it basically says you're going to be on, first of all, the first things are going to be taken care of is what's called alternative fuel corridors. So you won't have that range anxiety when you go from Austin to Tucumcari, New Mexico, that you know that there will be places every 50 miles that you'll be able to charge at. They'll also have standards on size, power, how they take payment, what their uptime is. So there is an attempt. Now, again, it's in its nascent stage here. Some of the states are going out with their RFPs right now. So there is an attempt to do that. You know, Lou Allen talked a little bit about our electrical system, and it's very decentralized. We have RTOs and ISOs and states and even munis and co-ops that have their own rules and things like that. A lot of folks, those I talk to, say that, you know, the US system actually, and we talk about grid outages and things like that, it still operates pretty well. But I think it would be nice if, again, my opinion, if there were some standardization. And I know FERC has some standardization and stuff, but the ISOs and RTOs have a lot of autonomy with how they operate. And some people blame, without looking at all the issues with Winter Storm Uri and some issues associated with that, because of our distinct and unique systems and ability to interact and connect. That may have been overblown, but yeah, some standardization is nice. But again, in the framers of our Constitution have this concept of federalism, which does keep some autonomy at the local level, and we tend to cling to that a little bit. So I think that's one of the nice things about our American experiment is that federalism in trying to strike that right balance.
But the military is ahead of everybody. It should be, right?
Well,
Yes
I
or
think
no?
we've done a few things. You talk about integration and other things that we've done. We have been in the forefront. GI Bill, educating people, getting people job skills, but with the intent of our goal of what is our mission? What is the mission? And
I mean,
to
in
some
terms of
extent,
technology.
yeah, well, absolutely. You look at the internet. You look at so there's the thing called DARPA that is really looking to try to figure out what's next. But I think the military has been instrumental in helping go with pushing technology forward.
Absolutely.
in doing some things. And I support the Army's office, and we're doing things. Army's Office of Energy Initiatives, and we're trying to do some things as well. There's a trade-off of doing things because it's pushing the envelope, or it's new stuff, and balancing cost. And so sometimes we'll want to do something, but someone says, but that's going to cost me more. Where's the budget coming from? Or what do you want me to cut if you want me to implement this thing?
Nothing for the military, cut nothing for the military.
Cut nothing for the military. But we do have one could argue that we spend a little bit of money on some things that aren't necessarily geared towards the warfighter. And I won't mention on this podcast, but if I could, I know I'd get you going, John, if I told you about what's going on in some of the libraries on the military. So I'll leave it at that.
I do know. I interviewed for Secretary of the Army under President Bush. So
Hey, Bryan, real quick,
go ahead.
we're coming to an end here, Bryan. What's in front of you for the next 6 months, other than the Texas State Cedar Solar Farm project that a lot of people know about?
Well, actually, we won. I was awarded the other day. It was good news for the North Texas Municipal Water District. So they're looking to utilize, they got land, they got load, and are looking at solar. So we're going to do the feasibility study for that. So that's interesting. And I think really there's a lot of obviously water treatment, water plants out there. So that we're looking at a landfill project for the military. And clearly there's a lot of municipal landfills there. And that's really kind of a win-win. What else would you use the space for? Right. So whether you like solar or not, that's a hard one to argue against. So working at that, the military trying to figure out, they had a RFP for ERCOT. So trying to do some big buys that could be spread out across many of its assets. And they're looking at in the regulated market in North Carolina, similar type of thing. So trying to figure that out. How do we do that? how do we do that within the rules that we have within the government, and still getting and doing it at a price point? Because in many cases, renewables, there's a premium for that. And we have to realize that. Everyone says, oh, do renewables, do this, do that, but there's a premium. And how can you do things more cost effectively within budget? And then again, just a lot on the EV charging space with 4 different projects right now, and probably good chance of being awarded a large city and looking at trying to do public charging for them.
Well, pencil in joining us at the Digital 360 Summit, which will be coming up soon in September. And I'm going to share my screen real quick to just talk about it. It's going to be at Star Park in San Marcos. It's our 5th edition, and we're going to have 15-minute keynotes and 30-minute keynotes, a total of 20-some keynotes, and some 9 panels. And it's going to be a fabulous event talking about networks and cities and mobility and energy and water, wastewater, buildings and infrastructure, sensors, edge compute platforms, cloud analytics, and more. And obviously, Llewellyn King will be there doing a keynote, and John Butler will be there doing a keynote, and it will be a fabulous event. And these are the folks that spoke last year and sponsored last year. And, you know, Cedar is all about these 9 building blocks, and we're building a solar farm to crack the code on the green hydrogen and many other things. And we thank the, you know, the university for sponsoring the Digital Roundtable. Final thoughts, Bryan?
Well, I thank you for having me. It was more than I expected. I didn't know that John was such an accomplished singer and guitar player, but we covered a lot of topics and things that were of interest to me, though, as a former military officer. I do think that my experiences there are interesting, interweaved with what's going on with a lot of different things, with technology, with energy, and appreciate everyone's thoughts and comments.
Absolutely. Final thoughts, gentlemen?
I think it was a great discussion.
Go ahead, Llewellyn.
Say likewise, I think we are really in a time of great change. It's a seminal time, and a lot of things will come to bear. I would like to sort of touch on Donnie's question. I think we will build large central station power again, and that, believe it or not, they'll be built at the behest of the government because of the fear of running out of electricity. Your situation in Texas gets increasingly fragile. I'm going to be interviewing the head of ERCOT soon, and I'm keen to hear what he thinks about the future. You're definitely going to have a capacity market of some kind in Texas, but the migration into Texas, the tremendous arrival of people from all over the country, is such that you may have a severe electricity crisis. It's a very interesting time.
Absolutely. Johnny?
I think it's an interesting time, and us Texans always come to find a solution. Very seldom we complain. Sometimes we make it hard in Texas to get the ones that's fit to be here to move on.
You need to fix your educational system to attract the best kind of immigrants.
Well, I think so too. Also, I think this is a great discussion. What I really like is the fact that the ideas that have come out of the military. You know, I was trained as a organizational person, and the greatest military scholar, Mark Janowitz, was one of my mentors. So it's been good. And
Bryan, I have to leave you. I have a commitment. I'm sorry. Bye-bye.
Bryan,
Good to see you, Bryan.
We gotta hear this. Right, Willie. On the road again. Can't wait to get back on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends, and I can't wait to get on the road again.
Hey,
Woo!
Willie is 90 years old.
wow.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Johnny.
Okay, Bryan, I sent you some stuff, and I'm gonna send you some more stuff.